Hi everyone, for those who didn't catch the first part of this series, my name is Jessica Harrison. I am an autistic autism researcher, currently working on empathy. So welcome to the second part of this empathy series, Help Me to Empathise with My Autistic Child. Before I get started, I want you to know that there's no rule book and there are no guidelines for showing empathy to your autistic child. The researchers haven't really considered how to show empathy to autistic people. Most of the research is focused on how we don't have empathy. So this webinar is primarily coming from the autistic experience. It's informed by not just my experience, but the experience of many autistic individuals who I've had the pleasure of having discussions with about this. I'm going to focus the first part of this webinar on meltdowns and understanding meltdowns, in the hope that, with a greater understanding of what your child's going through, you might be able to empathise with them a bit more. And then we're going to move on to how to empathise with sensory issues and just help you be a bit more in tune with some of the things that your autistic child might face. And I know the meltdown stuff can be a bit confronting, but I think it's really important that you develop a greater understanding of your child's experiences as an autistic individual. And it's important to learn strategies on how to help. So even though it's a bit confronting, I think it's really, really important. And you can pause at any time and take a break or whatever. I just think it's a really important topic that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention. Okay, so as we discussed in the last webinar, empathy is about thinking and feeling. So it's about identifying another person's emotions and also understanding their thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. And the feeling part, or the affective part of empathy, is about experiencing a sense of the other person's emotions. It's about feeling with them. If they're upset, you're upset. If they're excited, you're excited. Okay, so we're going to work on a scenario initially. So this is a little meltdown scenario. So your child comes home from school and they have a complete meltdown. They're screaming, they're kicking everything, they're crying, and they're just a bit out of control. They're not in control of their own behaviour. And they accidentally kick a hole in the wall as they throw themselves to the ground. And I suppose the question is, what do you do? And what can you do? What's going to help here? And as we all know, there's no one right way to deal with something like this, and there's no place for judgment on what's right and what's wrong. So what I'm here to do is hopefully to help you to understand what your child's going through at that time, so that with that greater understanding of their feelings and their thoughts, so with that greater empathy, you might be able to make an informed decision as to how you respond to these situations. And before we move on, I was hoping that you could take some time and maybe pause this video just to see and maybe write down how you think you would respond to a situation like this. So just pause the video and write that down. Okay, let's consider some common responses. So if we're being realistic, there's going to be a whole range of responses that parents might have to this situation. Some parents might yell at their child and tell them to stop kicking. Some parents might wait until the child has calmed down and then give them a bit of a stern talking to about the damage to the wall and the hole. If the child's older, some parents might punish them for the damage that they've done. Other parents might ignore the meltdown completely and ignore the child completely. Others might try to cuddle them during or wait until they calm and then reassure them. So there are countless options in terms of how you would respond. So hopefully, with a greater understanding of meltdowns in general, you can apply that to your child and understand their meltdowns and what that's like for them. And then you'll be able to select your your response a bit more with a bit more information and a bit more understanding. So as I said, empathy is about feeling with a person and understanding what they're going through. And I think this is one of the biggest hurdles that parents of autistic kids face is understanding how their child is feeling and why they're behaving in a certain way. And that's especially the case with meltdowns. I think a lot of people struggle to understand what's going on in a meltdown if they haven't had it themselves. So to help you get an idea of what your kid might be going through in a meltdown, there's a list of emotions here. It's different for everybody. Obviously, everything's different for everybody. But this is the basic idea of some of the feelings that your child might be experiencing at the time of a meltdown. And it's a whole range of negative emotions. The thing to remember as well is that there's never one emotion at a time in a meltdown. They're always feeling more than one. And it's no wonder that their behavior can get out of control and that can be yelling and on the ground and kicking about. It's because they feel out of control. It's because the emotions are too strong and too complex to process. And I have an exercise for those of you who are comfortable doing it, and that is to pick 3 emotions from this list. Preferably pick 3 that you think your child experiences in a meltdown or just in general. And what I want you to do is really try to feel those emotions for a second and think how you would behave if you were the same age as your autistic child and you experienced those 3 emotions at once. So pause the video for a moment and take time to understand this. Okay, so as you might see, it's not easy for your child to manage these emotions. It's really not easy for anyone to manage these emotions. And the thing to remember is that your autistic child would often feel some of these emotions all day at school, and they often find really hard to hold it in at school. So it's no wonder they tend to fall apart when they get home. I think most adults probably would too if they felt this kind of strong emotion. I know it can be kind of confronting to do that activity and to really kind of understand how difficult this is for children, but it's so important that if you haven't experienced this yourself, it's so important that you try to get an understanding of what they're going through. And now that you know how your child could be feeling, now that you have some understanding of what's going on, you'd have greater empathy towards this situation. You'd have greater understanding of their feelings and their thoughts and the resulting behaviors. So if you don't mind, I want you to think about how you'd respond to that scenario again. So the scenario that we did earlier. So take a moment to think about, now that you have a bit of a greater understanding, hopefully, take a moment to think how you would respond to that scenario. So just pause here and note that down. Okay, so now that you're back, I suppose the question is, did your response change to the scenario or did it stay the same? Or are you still completely unsure of how to respond? Because that is common. It's not easy. And as I said earlier at the start, there's definitely no right answer or right response to something like this because there's a lot of intense and complex emotions going on. However, I would expect that those who may have yelled, when they first thought about this scenario, those who thought that they might yell, may be less likely to, now that they kind of have some idea of the emotions that the child's already experiencing. Okay, so we're about to get to some of that more, the easier stuff, the non-meltdown stuff. But before we do, I just want to talk about why punishment is not really a good way to respond to a meltdown, even if they accidentally damage something at the time. The first thing to understand is that for a lot of autistic kids, a meltdown is really the only way you're going to see their distress. Most of them can't come to you and tell you how they feel. Um, that's difficult for all kids to come to a parent and say, I feel like this. So if the child can't tell you how they feel, they're going to show you, and you're going to see a meltdown. Maybe if they do that. The other thing to think about is that many autistic kids fight hard to keep it together at school. So they're feeling some of these emotions at school and they're fighting hard to keep it together because they don't feel safe expressing their emotions there. They don't feel safe letting their guard down at school. And, they're not all successful with this, of course. Some of them have meltdowns at school. But as a general rule, most kids try to hold it together until they get home, and they try really hard to hold it together. So it's no wonder that they explode or they fall apart when they get home. It's because it's their safe space. And I'm not suggesting that they choose to fall apart when they get home. It's not a conscious decision, but it's more of a coping thing. No one can hold on to strong emotions for such a long time. They have to let it out at some point. So it's like the minute your child feels comfortable and they feel safe enough to let their guard down, everything just comes out at once. It all just comes out. And this is why, it's not good to punish them or to yell at them for having a meltdown, because when you're yelling at them or something like that, or having a negative response, you're telling them that the only place they feel safe to let their guard down and let their emotions out is actually not a safe space at all. So they actually can't do that there. And it's kind of suggesting that the only way that they know how to let their emotions out is wrong. And I've chatted to many autistic adults about this who have experienced this, and most adults who were in trouble as children when they had a meltdown, most of them have learned to internalize their emotions more and more. So they have a meltdown, they get in trouble, they learn to hold it in more and more. And eventually it gets to the point where they don't really express anything. So, and they don't tell anyone how they're feeling, and they don't show anyone. You just won't see it. And that might be a bit easier than dealing with a meltdown and all the broken things if your kid has really strong meltdowns, but it's not good. If they're internalizing it, it means that they could be going through hell. They could be going through a really tough time and no one would know. You wouldn't know and no one would know. And I think that's really scary. So, if I had to choose between the peace and quiet or the hole in the wall, I'd be taking the hole in the wall. I'd be taking a whole bunch of holes in the wall, because it means that they're feeling emotions and they're expressing them. They're not holding on to them and keeping them in. One more thing as well to consider with meltdowns is that many people don't realize that autistic kids understand how their meltdowns affect people. So people sometimes feel like they need to teach the autistic child how their meltdowns are affecting them and how their meltdowns are affecting the family. But I can tell you that for the most part, most kids know, and they often feel guilty or embarrassed about the negative impact that they're having on other people. So it's not really necessary to kind of try to encourage them to manage their emotions differently by making them, I guess, feel guilty about how their current situation is affecting everyone else. It's, they already know. Chances are they already have a really good idea of how this is impacting others, and they just are struggling to control it anyway. Okay, so what are the options and how can we respond to these meltdowns? Well, firstly, I'm not suggesting that we let kids run around kicking holes in the walls or breaking things. Obviously, autistic kids, like any other, will sometimes be naughty on purpose. to push the boundaries. But what I am saying is that when we see children doing something, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves why and what does this behavior mean? So empathy is all about understanding their emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors. So when we see them do something, we need to consider, is it a meltdown? Are they inconsolable? Or did they throw their plate because they weren't allowed a third dessert? So if it's the desserts thing, that's for you to figure out. If it's a meltdown thing and they're struggling to manage their emotions, we're going to kind of go through that a bit more now. The first rule I would say is don't yell, because as I said before, it's that judgment that comes with it. The way I see it, yelling equals a loud noise plus judgment, which equals heightened distress, which often equals a prolonged meltdown. It can make things worse. The second thing to do is to try to calm them down if you know how to, by offering them something that makes them happy or calm, like a weighted blanket or toy, or make the room dark or something like that. But the big warning is, if you don't know what helps them, if you don't know what's going to calm them down, do not try to experiment when they're having a meltdown. Don't try new things, don't introduce new things, because that's overwhelming. And that could make them worse and more distressed. So if you're not sure what to do, just leave them settle, because they will settle eventually. The third thing I would suggest to do is, when they're back to normal, when they're regulated and they're calm and they're relaxed, it's a good time to show empathy and to show you understand what was going on for them and to show that you feel for them. So tell them you could see that they were really upset. Identifying feelings is cognitive empathy. So tell them that you could see that they were really upset. Tell them you're sorry that they felt that way, or that it upsets you to see them upset. That's the feeling part of empathy. So it's about making these things explicit for them, because it might not always be obvious. It might not always be obvious that you feel for them in this situation, or that you understand. Even if you do, it's just about making it explicit so it's really clear that you get it. The final thing that I would suggest trying is seeing if they're open to talking about it. This is hard. Talking about feelings can be hard for all kids. So I recommend keeping it quite simple. And remember that questions demand an answer. If you ask someone a question, you're putting them on the spot and they have to give an answer, or they're expected to give an answer. So if you're not sure if they're fully calm yet, it's probably best to stick with statements like what I've just said. I'm sorry you were upset, or I feel upset when you're upset, something like that. And if it seems that they're up for it, up to talking a bit more, start with something simple, like, are you okay now? Or were you upset about something that happened at school? So these are really simple, closed questions that don't demand a lot of their energy to think of a response and to think of a coherent sentence to respond back. So it's just about scaffolding and starting easy. And then as they get used to it over a period of weeks, months, years, however long it takes, as they get used to it, talking about it, they'll be able to handle the more difficult questions. And when they're used to or ready for the more difficult questions, you can say something like, do you know what things made you so upset? Sometimes it's a lot of things that add up. Do you know what some of those things were? When they become even more comfortable, you could add something like, if we work it out together, we might be able to change those things so they don't upset you as much. So it's about finding what works for your kid, obviously, and just always start small. So start with statements. Um, and if you can see that they can handle that fine and they can respond, maybe you want to try a question, maybe you want to leave it till next time. So yeah, just it's situational and it's unique to the child to see what's going to happen. But the general idea is about building their ability to discuss emotions and to discuss their triggers that led to this. Because when they can discuss their emotions and their triggers, it's empowering for them. It's giving them the skills that they need to be able to communicate what's wrong and eventually to be able to advocate for themselves and say, you know what, that beeping sound I can't handle, turn it off because I'm getting stressed out. So it's just about building them slowly to that point where they'll be able to, as adults, tell someone when something's wrong. And it'll take time, but they'll get there eventually. It's just about a lot of practice. Okay, so in this webinar, we've only gone through one meltdown scenario for one imaginary child. Your child's unique. They have their own way, they do their own things, not to mention there's the age thing to consider. So you need to develop your own plan on how to respond to their meltdowns and how to respond to their strong emotions. Now that you've learnt something about empathy and you've learnt a bit about meltdowns and how that could feel, you need to take some time to think about ways that you can respond to your child. Would you try to make the room dark and quiet, or would you offer them a weighted blanket? Are you able to ask your child beforehand what's going to help? Are they at that point where you can say, hey, what will help you when you've got strong emotions, when you're really upset? Because if they can tell you, that's awesome. So it's just about maybe take down some notes about what might help or what you could try. And when you're doing that, don't forget that list of emotions that they could be feeling, and keep that in mind as you're trying to work through some strategies and some ways that might work for your child. And if you're a bit stuck and you're not sure where to start, maybe start with just brainstorming, no wrong ideas, write it all down, everything that pops into your head, and then just cross off the ideas that you evaluate later as not being the best thing to try. So it'll just give you some ideas and something to look at later, or to think about before this happens again, and you can be a bit more prepared. So take some time to pause this video and work through that. Now that we've talked about meltdowns, I want to move on to empathizing with sensory sensitivities. Often, if we help an autistic child to avoid sensory triggers, we can reduce their overwhelm and distress, and there's a less chance that they're going to have those strong negative emotions. So they should be a bit more relaxed and calm. The big thing with sensory sensitivities is that non-autistic people often struggle to understand the real impact of sensory triggers on autistic people. Sometimes even if we explain it explicitly, people just often don't understand. So I just want to give you an example of that happening with me, just so you can hopefully understand the impact that this can have. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at uni for a meeting, and our group went in the elevator to go down. And just before the doors closed, another 8 or 10 people went in the elevator. So we were stuck. Everyone could barely even just let out a breath because we were all packed in like sardines. So what happened was the elevator stalled and there was a piercing alarm. It was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. It was so bad and so painful. Um, Everyone was kind of a bit rattled and a bit scared, possibly me more so. I was so, it hurt so much that I actually couldn't move. I couldn't think or do anything until it stopped, really. So it's a bit hard to explain, but it was bad. Um, and afterwards, everyone was a bit tentative to get back into the lifts again. Again, me a bit more so, because I didn't want to risk hearing that noise again. It was so severely, extremely painful and so debilitating that I couldn't do anything. I was scared of lifts. I didn't want to go back into a lift. Um, I realized that that was a problem, especially because I can't do stairs. So I dealt with it straight away. So, me being a responsible psychology student, I thought, I know, I will chat to someone about it and work through it and it'll be fine. So, I went to see a counsellor and I just explained what happened. You know, we got in the lift, it stalled, and the sound was so painful that it was crippling. And I told her, I made it clear it was the sound. It was debilitating. So I told her that I now feared going into one of those death boxes, um, because I just couldn't risk it. And her response was basically, you know, yeah, I can understand that. It would have been really scary to think that the elevator was falling. And I was kind of left there thinking, like, what is she talking about? I never said that I was worried about it falling. I never was worried about it falling. I'm still not worried about them falling. That was never the concern. The concern was that the pain of that alarm, that was the concern. It was, and I know people often struggle to understand it, even if I explain. But yeah, so she, as a counsellor, even though I spent like half an hour talking about the pain of this alarm and how it impacted and how bad it was, she still thought I was fearful of falling down a couple levels. Anyway, so it just shows that people don't always understand, even if they're in the profession, mind you. I ended up dealing with it by myself. I just kind of exposure therapied and threw myself in a few lifts, and you know it was fine. But I guess the point is that unless you have sensory sensitivities or sensory issues, you can't really fully understand what it's like. But what you can do is you can understand enough to help your child and support your child if they have sensory issues. And that's the hope, is that you can just learn enough and understand enough to help them. So how can we empathize with sensory issues? Like anything else, there's really no set rules. I think the first thing we need to do, though, is acknowledge that they're issues. So your child's sensory issues aren't, it's not about your kid being fussy or being hard to deal with, or, you know, it's not an inconvenience. It significantly affects our quality of life. It seriously affects our quality of life. And there's research on that, you know, for example, sound pollution, noise pollution, sorry, affects everyone's quality of life. So just imagine that, but a lot worse. So yes, the first thing that needs to happen is that people acknowledge that it's an issue and that people understand that it is a significant issue and that it has a big impact on our quality of life. You know, at the very least, that impact could be your child can't concentrate or relax when they're in that sensory overwhelm. The worst may be extreme distress, persistent phobias, out of control meltdowns where they accidentally get hurt or something like that. So, yes, we need to acknowledge it as a life impacting issue. The next thing we need to do, I think, is to observe the child. So watch them closely and watch how they respond to the environment. Are they squinting in the light? Are they reacting strongly or refusing to eat certain foods? Just just keep an eye on how they're kind of interacting with the world a bit. If you're at the shopping centre, watch what they're like on the shopping centre in the shopping centre. Do they put their hands on their ears as you walk past the food court or walk through it? And if they do, respond to that. Show that you understand that behavior of putting their hands on their ears and ask them if it's too loud. And then show that you understand the impact of that and maybe offer solutions to reduce the trigger. Maybe you could offer to take the long way around to avoid the food court. Maybe you want to ask them if they would like to bring their headphones next time you go to the shops. My biggest suggestion would be, though, is don't just avoid the food court and say nothing. Don't just accommodate their sensory needs without letting them know. Because I just think you need to tell them what you're doing and why. Even if they're young, even if they're 3 years old, is that too loud for you? Okay, next time we won't come past this way. Or next time, bring your headphones or something. By communicating this, what you're doing is you're showing that you understand their behavior and you understand what they're going through, and you're showing them that you're willing, as their parent, you're willing to accommodate them. And this is going to make them more likely to come to you next time. And again, like the other thing, it's about empowering them. So if they know that you're going to respond, and if they know that this is perceived as a serious issue, they might be more likely to ask you for help in the future when something's bothering them. And they might be more likely to ask for accommodations from other people in the future and to really advocate for their needs. So yeah, it's just about empowering them and communicating with them and giving them that space so that they can learn this. We also need to consider other sensory issues, like maybe they cough after you put perfume on. Maybe you notice them fidgeting and scratching a lot when they're wearing that new shirt that you got them. So it's just about observing and then responding, because life can be hard if you've got sensory issues. So do what you can to make it easier for them. But as I said, make sure that they know what you're doing and why you're doing it, so that they can learn these ways of managing sensory triggers, and they can learn to advocate for themselves. I've always kind of said that if parents and teachers managed sensory issues and addressed sensory triggers, there'd probably be a lot less negative behaviour to manage. So I know that that's an issue in schools where teachers are often worried about managing behaviour. But I think if they address the sensory triggers, there's a lot less issues to deal with. So now I just want to talk about empathizing with other issues. So things like routine changes, meeting new people, interacting in large groups, or going into really unstructured situations where your child might not be exactly sure what to do. Not all autistic people have anxiety or anything, but it is more common. So again, it's just observing and watching and seeing how they respond to things like this. And also see how they respond later in the day. So they might cope fine if you take them out somewhere that's really loud and it's really crowded or whatever. They might look like they're fine and they're interacting, but they might fall apart a little bit when they get home. So keep an eye on how they are afterwards as well. And it'll help you to gauge how overwhelming these situations are, and help you to gauge if they've got anxiety as well about them. And once you understand that, you're more able to accommodate them and to help them through it. So I'd suggest parents, if you've got kids that have anxiety about new situations or sensory issues that will be impacting in new situations, I suggest you prepare them as much as possible for these. So tell them where you're going, who's going to be there, what's going to happen. If they're really anxious, some kids can be really, really anxious about this. It might help to show them a photo of the venue or where you're going or something. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. And it's important that you explain to them that unexpected things happen. So it's important that they know that while you're going to accommodate them where you can and prepare them, not everything can be prepared for. Yeah, they just need to know they can't be under this expectation that parents or caregivers are going to take care of everything, because it's just not going to happen. And again, just make sure they know why you're preparing them and how, it's that communication. Because if they see how you're preparing them for anxious or overwhelming situations, they can learn how to do it for themselves. And that's, again, empowerment. It's about giving them the ability to take care of these things themselves in the future when they're older. And I recommend you encourage them to be part of this process as early as possible. And it might be as simple as saying, oh, we're going to the food court today, or we're going to the, I don't know, bowling alley or somewhere loud. So you'll tell them, we're going here. It's going to be loud. Maybe you want to bring your headphones. So what you're doing is you're communicating to them, telling them what the situation is, why it is a potential trigger, and offering a solution of how to resolve that. And it's just scaffolding them and teaching them, and they'll learn to do it themselves. When they're older and more experienced, you might want them to take on more responsibility in preparing for these things. So, for example, if you have a teenager who's nervous about going to a new restaurant, you could encourage them, look up the menu online, pick what you want or whatever, look up the venues, see what it's like. And so they're taking on more responsibility in managing their own overwhelm or anxiety. And it's just empowering them to take control again so that they can deal with these things themselves. Okay, so in summary, we've talked about empathy, and that is identifying another person's feelings and understanding their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And it's also about feeling with another person. And again, the main thing about empathy is that it does not always equal behavior, and you cannot always see it, and you cannot always expect to see it. So, if you're in doubt, just assume that they have empathy. Just assume. We've spoken about meltdowns and gone through, I guess, some of the strong and complex emotions that happen with that. And I'd recommend, if you're struggling to understand these or you're not sure how to respond, just revisit that, revisit the emotions and try to think maybe what would help you, or what would help you if you were a child in that situation. And of course, respond calmly and try to encourage that talking about emotions. It'll take a while, but when they learn how to talk about their emotions and their triggers, they're going to be a bit more able to manage themselves. And then we moved on to sensory issues, and my little rule is: number one, acknowledge that it's a problem. Number two, understand the significant impact of it. Number three is observe, watch them, see how they respond to the environment, then respond and try to reduce the trigger. And at the whole time, involve them in the process so that they can learn to do this. Even if they only take on the teensiest bit of control on this, or the teens this bit of responsibility, something is better than nothing. And it could take years before they can even do the tiniest little bit, but it's about allowing them to do that. It's about not doing everything for them without them knowing. And then we discuss other issues like crowded places or new places, because they're more likely to experience anxiety as an autistic person. So it's just about preparing them for it, explaining the limitations of being prepared so that they don't think that you're some magical person who's going to fix everything before it happens. So being realistic, and again, involving them, teaching them, and empowering them to do it themselves. So that's all for this webinar. Thank you for watching, and I do hope that it has been helpful. Thanks.